Okay, we are ready if the opponents are back and ready. So as you judge, if you're ready, we're good to go.
Okay, let's see. So we're starting with Thomas and Chinpo.
That's correct.
Okay. And it's Finland joining NATO?
Yeah.
All right, I am ready.
Okay. Opponents, are you ready? Okay. I have a 7-minute speech, and I'll just begin on my first word. Resolution. The accession of Finland to NATO will do more harm than good. A few definitions. We define will to mean in the future, evaluating all future possibilities. NATO as the North Atlantic Treaty. And a few background info. We evaluate this round in the future under the framer's intent of will, and we have to evaluate this round through possibility and magnitude of the both possibility of how likely an argument will happen and the impacts that come with that. And if the Gov can provide a single harm that is worth the magnitude, then we win with that one harm. Our criteria for this debate is international security, as we see this as a value. And so going on to contention 1, increasing provocation, uniqueness. This accession to NATO makes Putin more unstable, as Putin is currently testing nuclear missiles. Nations like North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE will increase support for Russia's war efforts as Russia becomes more and more aggressive. We have Egypt considered sending tens of thousands of rockets to Russia, and the Kremlin spies claiming that the Emirates are their new best friends. And Israel simply isn't willing to give serious help to Ukraine as it battles the Russian invasion. And these are all things that were leaked in the Pentagon Papers recently. And this further proves that NATO alliances will only push this boundary and make Russia more aggressive. Internal links. Historic neutrality. Finland has had a long-standing tradition of neutrality and maintaining a non-aligned stance, particularly during the Cold War since 1948. Joining NATO, which is a military alliance, can be seen as a departure from this historic stance and can potentially strain relations with Russia, which has expressed concerns about NATO expansion in its neighborhood. With Finland's accession, Sweden is now also taking a amount of time. Sweden is now also pushing to join, despite declaring neutrality since 1550. Past conflicts with Russia. Finland shares a history of conflicts with Russia, particularly during World War II, where Finland fought several wars against the Soviet Union, including the Winter War from 1939 to 1940 and the Continuation War from 1941 to 1944. It has maintained a cautious approach to its relationship with Russia since then. Joining NATO could potentially trigger concerns from Russia, which may perceive it as a threat or an encroachment on its sphere of influence. Geographic proximity to Russia. Finland shares a long border with Russia, and any actions that are perceived as provocative or threatened by Russia since joining NATO will have consequences for bilateral relations. Russia has shown sensitivity to NATO expansion near its borders in the past, and Finland's proximity to Russia will heighten concerns. Economic relations with Russia. Finland has significant economic relations with Russia, including trade, investment, and energy cooperation. Joining NATO will potentially have economic implications if Russia were to respond with economic measures, such as sanctions or trade restrictions, which harms Finland's economy. And Finland has, Biden has said that he would protect every inch of NATO ground. If he doesn't protect Finland, he looks weak. If he does, he basically declares open war against Russia. So you see that under any circumstance, this approach of Finland joining NATO is just making Russia more and more aggressive. Impacts. This strengthens Middle East alliances between Russia. These are points proven in the Pentagon paper leaks. Middle East U.S. allies can strengthen their support either through weapons or oil production, and the harms of Finland joining will only provocate these actions to continue. And military commitments. Joining NATO would also entail certain military commitments, including potential contributions to NATO missions and operations, which is going to make Finland look even more aggressive in Russia's eyes. Contention 2, unstable global de-escalation. Uniqueness. This comes at the point of maximum inconvenience for the alliance as the West walks the tightrope of offering increased military support for Ukraine while simultaneously containing the potential for multilateral escalation. Internal links. The clash of civilizations, Samuel Huntington claimed. The most significant dividing line in Europe runs along what are now the boundaries between Finland and Russia. There's a disconcerting irony here. Many blame the current war on Ukraine partly on the West's rapid expansion of NATO following the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, while attempting to mitigate the problems caused by past NATO expansion, the alliance is speeding through an application that was not even on the agenda a year ago. We should not plant the seeds of expansion regret for tomorrow as we deal with the unwanted harvest of yesterday's growth in the alliance. NATO can always decide to defend Finland if it decides to do so at a future impasse, even if Finland is not a member. The U.S. led a large coalition to liberate Kuwait in 1991 and fought to save South Korea from conquest in the early 1950s. Neither country was a NATO member at the time, and the U.S. and the others went to their defense. Impacts. This create the harms of recreating a Cold War era diplomatic stance. Geographic instability, heightening tensions between major powers could lead to increased instability in regions where they have competing interests. You're going to see something like a Cold War where they fight in regional conflicts and proxy wars, and humanitarian consequences. Conflicts and tensions between major powers can result in humanitarian consequences, including displacement of populations, refugees, and loss of life. Convention 3. More U.S. Involvement in Europe. Uniqueness. President Biden has warned Vladimir Putin that America and its allies are fully prepared to defend every single inch of NATO territory after the Russian tyrants claimed to annex 4 Ukraine regions. Quote, Mr. Putin, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Biden said at the conclusion of the remarks, focused on Hurricane Ian, every inch, internal links. With Finland joining NATO and becoming its official member, this means that all 832 miles of land border within the nation are part of NATO territory. Finland is building a 124-mile-long border fence to protect itself from Russia. This only refers to further provocational attempts to isolate Russia instead of diplomatic resolve. The risk of incursion by Russia would spark an immediate U.S. response to protect Finland as a NATO member, and this leads to the potential for arms races. Increased U.S. involvement potentially trigger an arms race between the U.S. and Russia, leading to increased military spending and diverting resources from other areas of importance. And this leads to impact on multilateral diplomacy. Increased U.S. involvement can also impact multilateral diplomacy efforts, such as those taken by international organizations, including the UN, the OSCE, and other regional bodies. This would affect cooperative efforts to address regional challenges and hinder diplomatic solutions. Impacts. The benefits of NATO receiving another member to the alliance is tremendous, but yet another purpose of another nation joining amidst the war needs to take all harm analysis done. The harms of a possible response by NATO far outweighs a united stance. Since the U.S. is taking for Ukraine, and admitting another nation who is actively using a Cold War era posture against Russia needs to be fully examined and going back to a Cold War era diplomacy, and with all of the current issues, with all of the current Russia-Ukraine issues with Russia aggression, this comes to show why this is such a bad idea, and this proves that this sole fact alone proves that harms outweigh any benefit that they can bring up, because we're talking about global disruption between the war of two superpowers. And so, for all these reasons, vote out. Thank you.
Okay. Give me 1 second. Let me open my timer. Okay. So, Judge, for a quick off-time roadmap, I'm first going to be going into. Oh, can you guys hear me all right? The people weren't able to hear me last round. Okay, cool. All right. So, for a quick off-time roadmap, I'm first going to be going into some observations about the resolution, then going into our contentions, and then going into the definitions of the debate, then our contentions, and then finally, if time permits, going back onto the flow and just touching on everything that they said in their last speech. Okay, so my time starts now. Apologies, my name is Rithlik, and I'm the first negation speaker on the on this resolution that was stated that we're debating on, right? Okay. So first, talking about the definitions, they say that that we should have our framework as be international security, but we actually disagree. We think that the framework should be the net benefits for all people, so not just international security, because Finland joining NATO could have effects on the people in Finland, the commerce in Finland, and things along those lines, not just international security. So if we only focus on international security, we're not actually counting for all the benefits that could occur, and that's why you should do for this round. You should have the weighing mechanism be net benefits for people in Finland and people in NATO. Okay, so now going on to our first contention. So our first contention is that it'll stop Russian aggression. So uniqueness 1. Putin has expressed his goal is to reunite all of the Soviet territory, which includes Finland. NATO's Article 5 states that if a country in NATO is harmed by a country outside of NATO, all of NATO will come to the defense of that country. But if a country is in mid-conflict, they cannot join NATO. This is what's happening in Ukraine. If Ukraine was part of NATO, NATO would completely defend Ukraine. Uniqueness 3. In the status quo, NATO is one of the things that Russia fears, being one of the most powerful world groups. Russia is not, I guess, dumb enough to invade a country that's part of NATO, because NATO has the backing of all of the world's greatest powers. It's mutually assured destruction. Think about it, Judge. This is exactly why nuclear war doesn't happen. So if nuclear bombs another country, the other country will nuclear bomb back, and there's going to be destruction everywhere. This is why Russia's completely afraid of NATO and won't actually go anywhere near them. And yeah, so that's exactly why. So that's the uniqueness 3. Uniqueness 4. If Finland joins NATO, they're eradicating any probability of war occurring. If Russia has already expressed that its goal is to reconquer everything that was part of the Soviet Union before, Finland being included. So if Russia had any chance of invading Finland before, it's all eradicated. It'll stop the aggression. Finally, Finland joining NATO will lead the way for other Scandinavian countries like Sweden to join NATO, and this will further prevent Russian invasion because these countries were once a part of Russia too, and Russia will aim to invade them. Subpoint 2. Russia is one of the biggest threats to NATO right now, and Russia's goal is to take over the many Baltic areas. NATO has currently very few members in the northern Baltic area, and Finland is going to be an amazing ally for aiding people in this area if Russia is to attack. Currently, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, which are NATO countries bordering Ukraine, have been saving refugees from Ukraine, have been providing aid to them. Adding Finland will help aid countries Baltic countries that could be invaded, which could be the next targets of Russia, which would save future hostilities. So what are our links? So if Finland was not in NATO, then Russia may attack Finland. This will decrease the quality of life in Finland, and you can think about everything that's happening in Ukraine right now, which will happen all over again. The economy of Finland will go to ruins. The quality of life will go to ruins, etc. Furthermore, NATO will have a better hold against Russia, which will prevent Russian expansion. Think about it. If Russia is going to invade a country like the Baltic areas, which have no NATO allies close to them, NATO has no way of aiding the Baltic areas or has no way of providing some sort of aid to this area. But if NATO has Finland, which is close by, NATO has somewhat of a hold of Russia. So if Russia is to do some very, very devastating action, like launch like large scale attacks onto these Baltic areas, NATO will have some sort of hold and be able to hold Russia accountable, which would prevent Russian expansion and increase the quality of life in these Baltic areas, as well as in Finland and NATO itself. Furthermore, NATO increasing the amount of power of NATO is really beneficial because NATO is a world power that's meant to impose checks and balances onto NATO is a world power that's meant to impose checks and balances onto many other countries, and it's supposed to essentially maintain peace. So NATO having more power and NATO having Finland in a very beneficial area is very beneficial for NATO's purpose as a whole. So now going on to and then a last link of NATO getting stronger is that if NATO gets stronger, it's able to check back China too, because China is in correlation with Russia. So if NATO is able to check back on Russia, they're also able to check back on China. Furthermore, NATO has a lot of NATO being stronger has a lot of other effects, because NATO supplies peacekeepers in an area about the world that need peacekeeping operations. They also have great international relations, which will have major improvements if NATO is strengthened, which is exactly what Finland joining NATO will do. Finally, we're going to talk about the Finland economy. Uniqueness 1. So So uniqueness 1, Finland. So uniqueness 1, Finland. Joining NATO will increase Finland's trade with many NATO countries because NATO has many countries that have a lot of booming economies that are able to trade with Finland. Under NATO, Finland will have better relationships with all these other countries that are in NATO, and this will boost Finland's economy. There's multiple impacts of this, Judge. Boosting Finland's trade with other countries will increase the quality of life of people in Finland, but also the quality of life of people in NATO. NATO as a whole is essentially meant to be a coalition of many countries working together to create a whole national organization. NATO's goal, I guess, is to have basically every country in the world in NATO, which is basically going to be full peace. Obviously not possible, but Finland joining NATO is just another step in joining all world's forces, creating all amazing trade, and this has many great effects for the world in general. So now going over everything I just said, I said first it stops Russian aggression because Putin wants to reunite all Soviet territory, and Finland is part of this. Even if there's a small, minute chance that Russia is going to invade Finland, now that chance is fully eradicated because now because Russia fears NATO, obviously. That chance is fully eradicated. Furthermore, Finland joining NATO gives NATO a hold in areas that they didn't have a hold in before, which increases their power. And finally, it improves Finland's economy. Okay, Now going on to what they said in their speech. So I already told you why we believe that the ring mechanism should not be international security, but the net benefits to all people in Finland, NATO, and outside of the world, which includes international security. Furthermore, they state that Putin is really aggressive and is gonna be provoked by by Finland joining NATO. Just clearly, this is false. Think about it. Putin has a mindset. Anyone not out of their mind would not think of going against NATO. NATO is 30 whole countries. They state themselves that anyone that goes against NATO, anyone that steps on NATO soil, attacks NATO soil, is going against every single country in NATO, Judge. So think about it. Russia's not going to be dumb enough to, or that's a harsh word, but is not going to be unintelligent enough to attack NATO or attack a country in NATO like Finland, and because they're going to have a massive backlash. They said that Russia is going to be more aggressive, but all we can assume, this is all I got out of their speech, is that Russia is going to be more aggressive and attack Finland or a similar country. Now, if they attack Finland, there's 0 point, as I've stated, because every country in NATO is going to attack them back. There's a really low probability that any of this is actually going to lead to a massive war, because there's a very low probability of this actually happening, because Russia is not going to be out of their minds to attack NATO. Furthermore, they say it's going to increase U.S.-Russia tension, but in general, I think what they mean to say is it's going to increase NATO-Russia tension, which is already really high. So because they bring a specific example of U.S. aiding any country in NATO, but it's actually going to be every U.S. Aiding Ukraine, but it's actually going to be every country in NATO aiding Finland. So it's actually going to increase Russia-NATO tension, which is something Russia doesn't want to do. Russia is not going to want to increase Russia-NATO tension. So it's not actually going to increase Russia-U.S. tension, it's going to increase Russia-NATO tension. And with that, I urge a strong affirmation vote. Thank you. Or, sorry, negation vote. Oops.
Okay. Is everyone ready? Judge ready? Opponents ready? Yep. Okay. So quick off-time roadmap before I do begin. I'll be going over the points of clash, summarizing what's the most important points that's so far studying this debate on. I'll try to make myself as clear as possible as we move along this case. And Judge ready? And I'll begin my 8-minute speech now. So Judge, first of all, let's look at the at the top of the flow. They talk about how we have to evaluate this round through net benefits and not international security. Judge, however, this is an international round. We're looking at how Finland's accession into NATO, Finland joining NATO, will affect global interglobal security, geopolitical peace. Net benefits part of that, Judge. That's the weighing mechanism. We still contest that international security is the better weighing mechanism for the entire world, as we're evaluating multiple nations, multilateral geopolitical relations, so on and so forth. Moving on. Let's talk about condition 1. They give multiple subpoints under this. I just flow all my responses to their subpoints, Judge. Their main point is basically stop Russian aggression, Judge. I like to point out the fact how Finland joining NATO does not stop Russian aggression in both of our worlds. That is not a unique harm that we're bringing or a unique benefit that the negation is bringing to prove why Finland joining NATO has a unique benefit. Russia will always be a war-poised nation towards Finland, and Finland joining NATO will only provocate this. I'll give you unique reasons why, how this affects a larger global stage later on in my responses. Putin's goal. They talk about how Putin's goal is to reunite the Soviet Union. Judge, that is a long falsified dream that Putin has been having for decades now. Putin simply will not achieve this goal. Again, Finland joining NATO does not ultimately guarantee that Russia might eventually will not have an incursion into Finland. Yes, they're playing a dangerous game with Russia. Now Finland is assessed into NATO. However, like my partners mentioned, the 823-mile long border. Anything can happen along those borders. And let's look at the past wars, for example, the Berlin Wall. With any Cold War stance nation, where a nation is poised to attack the other. For example, let's take a look at North Korea and South Korea. There's going to be an era of highly contested military conflict. The citizens of both nations are going to live in peace. Russia's always going to have war troop and reserves on the Finland border. That does not guarantee peace. That does not guarantee net benefits for the citizens of both Finland or Russia or the global stage as there's no ultimate net benefit for I'll take it at the end of time for Finland to join NATO. After Finland joins NATO, Russian reserve troops are still going to be on the border. But if they don't join NATO, the same thing is going to happen, Judge. Moving on, let's talk about how the unique harms of Finland joining NATO will occur. Like my partners mentioned, provocation. Russia has locked at the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia has locked Germany and Britain out of their natural gas supplies. How? By cutting off the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipeline. Judge, these are specific unique harms that Russia can further do to basically push the West, to confine the West into seceding to what Putin wants to do. Another example was how Russia, quote unquote, convinced Saudi Arabia to cut oil productions to the world in May. Saudi Arabia has announced that it's going to cut oil production drastically in May. Again, Saudi Arabia cut comes at a point where Saudi Arabia should not be cutting oil when oil is at a high demand. Why did Saudi Arabia do so? Russia simply, quote unquote, convinced them to. Through the Pentagon paper leaks, we have seen Russia has built a unique relationship between the Emiratis in the Middle East, and this relationship only continues to happen. Furthermore, let's look at the game that Putin is playing. The West is playing in Putin's world. Judge, in 2020, an ex-Marine was tried and convicted in Russia over allegations of spying. The same thing happened with a Wall Street journalist recently. The West is playing in Putin's game. Putin dictates the rules of how the West plays. The West is uniquely at harm and from Putin's basically war games. We are playing in Putin's sandbox, and Putin gets to dictate the rules. During the recent prisoner trade, we traded former WNBA star Brittany for a weapons dealer known as the great weapons dealer in Russia. Judge, that trade uniquely basically provides a fear, provides a harm for the U.S. as we traded the known weapons dealer for WNBA star. And again, when asked at the White House conference why Biden didn't trade back the ex-Marine, Putin basically said it's not on the table. You get your WNBA star back, or you get nothing. Judge, this proves how the West is playing in Putin's sandbox and the unique harm that Putin poses against the NATO Union and against the U.S. Finland joining NATO does not decrease the harm of an invasion. There's no unique benefits that NATO brings to the table for de-escalation, which is what will provide the most net benefits. Refer back to the idea of poking the bear. NATO was supposed to be consisted strictly of Western countries. Allowing Finland joining NATO right next to Russia increases its aggression and makes Putin more unstable. How is this uniquely harmful, Judge? Refer back to how Russia basically cut off Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipeline. Russia convinced Saudi Arabia to cut oil. These are all unique harms by Finland joining NATO, and how Russia increases its provocation and aggressional stance. Russia is already being aggressive to the rest of the world, staging an invasion in Ukraine, annexing Crimea in 2014, telling Saudi Arabia to cut oil productions. Peace is the only way to bring about net peace for everyone, and NATO doesn't do that. There's no unique there's no unique benefits that NATO brings for Finland or for the entirety of the NATO alliance or for the globe to provide peace in this region of conflict. NATO only provides a false sense of security for its citizens, claiming how once the minute Russia invades Finland, there'll be an all-out response to protect Finland. Judge, again, that is simply a false sense of reality, and there's no unique benefits that NATO can bring to Finland by doing so. Their second counter contention is Finland economy. Judge, they talk about how once they're in NATO, it increases Finland trade, how this makes prosperity with the nation. However, Judge, one trade-off of Finland joining NATO is that 2% of the GDP has to be devoted to NATO spending, NATO funding, NATO research. 2% of their GDP, Judge, is $5.9 billion US dollars. $5.9 billion US dollars of Finland's GDP has to be dedicated for NATO research. That's not directly beneficial for Finland's trade. Yes, there might be slight benefits of being in a NATO alliance. However, there was no unique harm. There's no issues with Finland's trade to begin with. Finland's trade is prospering. Their most exported goods is fish, as they are in a fishing market. Their coastlines are full of fish and natural resources. Finland has no issues with trade before joining the NATO alliance. Again, bring no unique benefits that the nation can claim on to win. However, the government has proven unique harm consequences and harm scenarios for why Finland joining NATO would do more harm than good. Again, refer back to how Russia can cut off Germany and Britain with their natural gas supplies, and how Russia convinced Saudi Arabia to cut oil production in May. Judge, this is all things that Russia can do to affect global peace, global net benefits, global security, international security through Finland joining NATO and poising a more aggressive stance. Now, go over to some drop points. The negation does not provide a response for unstable global de-escalation. Judge, that's condition 2. Flow the impacts through of harms of creating a Cold War era diplomatic stance, geopolitical instability, humanitarian consequences, flow the impacts through. Furthermore, condition number 3, they failed to give a response to that, flow the impacts through as well. The impacts being benefits of NATO receiving another member in this war-torn position ultimately poises Russia in a more aggressive stance, and flow through the impacts of the harms of a possible NATO response, which outweighs the united stance the U.S. is giving for Ukraine. Now, quickly go over the case one more time, Judge. Our contention one is increased provocation. This is the most contended point in this round, and this round should come down to this 1 point, and how both sides argue this point. We give unique harms to prove why Finland joining NATO will provocate Russia to do more drastic things on the global stage. Harm geopolitical tensions and heighten geopolitical tensions between both the U.S., NATO, Russia, and the Middle East. These are the most important actors in this round. And Finland joining NATO only provocates Russia to do more aggressive things. We only puts the West into Putin's playbox. For all those reasons, Judge, I strongly urge for a vote in the gov. Thank you.
Just to be clear, can you name all your 3 contentions again?
Okay, our contention number 1 is increased provocation. Contention number 2 is unequivocal global de-escalation. And contention number 3,
unequivocal global de-escalation.
Well, yeah. Contention number 2 is global de-escalation, and contention number 3 is more U.S. involvement in Europe.
Okay, thank you. Judge, I'm going to give you a quick off-time roadmap. There's a lot to cover, but firstly, I'm going to be covering off-case first. So I'm going to be refuting what the opponent said in their first speech. After I do off-case, I'm going to come back on case. Firstly, I'll refute what the opponent said in the last speech. And then lastly, I'm going to summarize everything for you. Time starts on my first word. But firstly, let's get on to the beginning of this debate, the framework. We think the framework should be net benefits. Net benefits is uniquely helpful for 2 reasons. Firstly, when we're considering a lot of people, considering international relationships is very big. International relationships depends on who you're viewing, depends on what your relationship wants to be, and in general is very confusing and verbose. And secondly, international relationships only apply to major countries. Major countries have more to gain for international relationships, and smaller countries often have less to gain, meaning that net benefits should be the framework, and net benefits kind of encompasses international security because international security can be easily impacted out under net benefits, so net benefits is just the best. So let's move on. Nextly, let's respond to my opponent's first contention of provocation. My opponent talked about Putin being unstable. Firstly, this turns to negative. Judge, if Putin is unstable, the West is going to think that he's going to explode. Putin will act not based on logical interest, will act on logical interest, but will sometimes, when he sees some opportunities, will take it into account. This means that let's say there's a conflict in a region which a NATO ally does not count in. So he might go to war with that country because it's not a NATO state, because he thinks he can get away with it. This turns to negative. Nextly, my opponents state that NATO, basically the crux of their argument is that NATO does not have checkback. We respond to this in 3 ways. Firstly, Article 5. Article 5 says that if a NATO country is attacked, every single NATO country will respond. As Putin does fear the organization of NATO, as he dislikes their expansion, as the other team mentioned, this means that he's unlikely to attack a NATO state. Secondly, NATO has nuclear nukes. This is important because smaller countries often lack nuclear weapons, and it was a promise that countries would be protected countries will be protected by this, meaning Putin will again not go to war with a nuclear state. And thirdly, NATO gives security to areas. NATO's presence simply gives security to the areas, calming them down and reducing conflict. With the mere presence of Article 5, it gives a calming effect to the entire region because it's unlikely anyone will invade with such a powerful person in charge. Nextly, let's talk about my opponent's next argument talked a lot about the Middle East, which is very interesting. Firstly, I'd like to point out Russia and Middle East relationships are always very rocky, and we don't really know what's going on there. The reason why Russia and the Middle East are right now friends with each other is because the U.S. had beef with Saudi Arabia with Jamal Khashoggi. The U.S., rightly so, caused international alarm, and Saudi Arabia didn't really like that. But let's talk about the UAE, because this one is really interesting. UAE, as we know, is a natural gas exporter, and Russia is the biggest natural gas exporter. But right now, Russia stopped exporting natural gas. So what does this mean? Now, UAE is the biggest natural gas exporter. So UAE is making tons of bank because Russia stopped producing oil. So obviously, they're going to be friends with each other. But when Russia starts producing natural gas again, they're not going to be so much friends. So Middle East relationships are on and off. And my opponents can say that we can see a tangible impact, and it's uniquely, the word unique means it only happens on one side of the debate, if you want to know. It doesn't really happen because it's really shaky with this. Nextly, we'll talk about the fact that Finland was neutral. Finland was neutral, but it was kind of bullied into being neutral. If you can see in the Winter War, Russia and Finland fought a lot, and Finland couldn't afford to lose men like that. Finland was winning the Winter War, of course, with Russian casualties increasing over 1 million, but Finland does not have the population to sustain such a war. So this wasn't more neutrality, it was more bought silence. Russia said, hey, we won't violently destroy you, and Finland was like, okay, we won't say it. It wasn't neutral because it really wanted to be. Nextly, my opponents talk about the 833 miles of the Russia-Ukraine border. And they say Russia-Finland border. They say because Finland has had previous attacks on Russia that they're going to be aggressive again after they join NATO. Firstly, this is not true. A war has not interrupted in the last 10 days. And secondly, just because a country attacked you doesn't mean you have to attack back. Britain attacked 130 countries. I don't see the UK being swarmed with enemy ships. Nextly, my opponents talk about the fact that Finland doesn't want to fight anymore, which we agree. They just want to defend their borders. It's a natural thing. So, Judge, let's go on to they talk a lot about global de-escalation and how we're walking the tightrope right now. So, firstly, let's respond to one of their main cruxes of the arguments. They said that if Finland is not a member, NATO can still defend. That is really not true. They give examples from the 1950s and 1991. Right now, countries are more fidgety because they have a lot to lose in a war. And we need a contractually bound thing, saying, oh, if I attack you, you will defend me 100%. That is deterrence. Not you will defend me, maybe, sort of, kind of. So these examples did happen, but it's way more concrete with NATO and way stronger. And if the opponents say, yeah, they can still defend, then Russia will still be intimidated in the status quo. So this point doesn't really have merit. Nextly, my opponents talk a lot about how Russia significantly attacked Ukraine because of NATO increased presence and Russia is being more aggressive because of NATO. Russia is not being aggressive because of NATO, clearly. NATO did not have any expansionist ideas when it was firstly invaded, and Russia often invaded NATO out of a whim there. Russia literally owns a special military operation, sent troops literally without a warning. They don't even call it a war to this day. This clearly proves that Russia's aggressive tendency was not the West's fault. And lastly, I'll expand to their invade in Europe one. They say that US supports NATO and that basically we have a risk of a US response if they involve, but that's the entire point. But the entire point is deterrence. There's a threat to respond, but as we showed before, they're unlikely to respond because of NATO's 3 points. And they mention a lot of impacts, but most of these impacts are the same thing. It basically says war bad, and war bad links in a lot of way with arms races and other things. So we pretty much have the same impact. There's impacts that are just a bit more wordy. Now, Judge, we are going to flip your flow. I'm going to be frontlining. I'm going to be refuting their refutes. Firstly, my opponents talks about how Russia will always be poised, but this is not true simply because of NATO checkback, as mentioned before. So you can cross-apply, just NATO checkback will solve. Nextly, Russia, the opponent mentioned that when it stands any NATO will be a voice, there'll be a highly militarized zone in between, but that's not really true because of the area where Finland and Russia are bordered. Finland and Russia are bordered in a very cold and icy area. It's very hard to have defensive fortifications through that. And even in the Cold War, they were not like that as well. And Russia, use another example, the Baltic states. The Baltic states is a NATO ally. It's on the border of Russia. There is no DMZ across the middle of the Baltics. So let's go on. The opponents also said that there's unique benefits because they mentioned a lot about how they blocked gas of Nord Stream 2 and the fact that the US traded WNBA star for a weapons dealer and that the US is not at a playing field advantage. Firstly, this isn't really merit. We traded them because they hold a lot of soft power. WNBA star over an ex-Marine. True, it may not have been a perfect fair trade, but to the Western world, that soft power was very important. And nextly, it doesn't show that we're in Russia's sandbox right now because Russia's actions are not perfectly understood by us and we're not rushing into things. We are taking it slow. That doesn't mean we're in a sandbox yet. And we are not really uniquely at harm because of Russia. It's not really true. My opponents talk a lot. I'm in my 15 seconds grace period, so I'll speak fast. My opponents talk a lot about peace for everyone, but it's unlikely that peace will happen when there's a huge war. And lastly, my opponents talk about the 2% military funding in Finland. that they must go through. But right now, Finland's military funding is 2.03%, meaning they meet the threshold, they won't have to spend any more. And NATO is a bigger trading ally than Russia, so we outwin. Thank you.
Okay. So let me pull up my stop. Okay. So I'm gonna first, in my speaking time, for a quick off-time roadmap, I'm first going to be going over major points of clash in this debate, and then I'll be going over to impact and weighing which side's impacts are better. And one sec, let me. Okay, my time begins now. Judge. Okay, so let's look over some of the major points of clash in this debate. So the first point of clash is on the weighing mechanism. The affirmation fails to provide a good reason why international security should weigh over net benefits. So I think, Judge, because net benefits encompasses international security as well as the net benefits also talks about the people of Finland, people in NATO. That's why you should use net benefits as a framework of this round. Okay, second point of clash. If we're saying that is Russia. Then the second point of clash is on if Russia is going to be provoked or not. The affirmation comes up here and says that Russia will cut off gas supplies to other countries when they're provoked because they have amazing relationships with the Middle East, and yada yada yada. As my second speaker mentioned, when Russia starts producing gas again, the Middle East relationships with Russia will tension up. So in the long term, actually, Russia does not have any good hold on anything with their relationship with the Middle East, because in the long term, Russia eventually needs to make money too, using their gas. And if they try to make money using their gas, the Middle East will no longer like Russia because now they're taking all of their customers. So in the end, their whole point about Russia being provoked and Russia being provoked. And then because Russia's provoked, they're going to use their Middle East allies as threatening actually has no merit. What we say about Russia as being provoked is that we're going to say Russia is going to be provoked maybe, but they're not going to do anything because logically they're not going to attack the whole of NATO, the whole backing behind NATO. That's why we win on this point of clash by saying that Russia being provoked actually doesn't do anything. And it actually doesn't do anything. Okay. And then finally they say the last point of clash is NATO is going to help Finland. So they state that NATO is not going to help Finland, but clearly based on Article 5, NATO is actually going to help Finland in an invasion, and this is very clearly obvious because it's basically on NATO's rules. All their other points you can refer back to my partner speech, which is like basically 2 minutes ago. So I'm not going to be going over into many more refutes. Okay, now going on to impact weighting. So the first major impact in this round is NATO, the strength of NATO and Finland combined in relationship to Russia. So our impact is that Finland has a very has a chance. It might be a small chance, but it's non-zero chance of being invaded. But it has an amazing magnitude. Think about it. How Russia invaded Ukraine. Think if that happened to Finland now. That could happen, and you should weigh magnitude over probability because if anything is supposed to happen in the real world, if there's a small possibility of a huge failure, then nothing operates. Now, what their argument also has, their argument in this regard is that Russia is going to cut off oil supply using their allies in the Middle East. But as we've proven, this is a very, very short-term impact, and it also has this is a very short-term impact and also has a very low magnitude because the people in the Middle East are also realizing that in the future, if they want to have a hold on Russia, they can't cut off their oil supply because then they're going to be losing to Russia in the future. Thinking in the long term, this impact has no merit, and we should always be prioritizing the long term in any debate round because thinking about the long term is because thinking about what happens 10 days from now versus 10 years from now. 10 days from now it could be worse, but if 10 years from now it's way better, and for every future generation it's better. So we should win on that. We should win on the fact that NATO and Finland's strength in relationship with their Russia should Finland and NATO's strength in relation to the invasion of Russia has a very we win on all those impacts, and we prioritize longer time frame and higher magnitude over probability. Furthermore, the next impact is the Baltic states. The affirmation. Now, as the negation, we have lots of solvency for the Baltic states point. We say that though there's low probability of Russia invading the Baltic states in the future, NATO having ground in this area will help them protect the Baltic states, which is a massive magnitude. They do not talk about anything about the Baltic state point that we bring up, so it flows through. And finally, about the Finnish economy, NATO is a way bigger trading ally than Russia. So NATO's economy and the quality of life of people in NATO is going to increase. So we went on the economy point too. So overall, Judge, we should win this debate mainly on the fact that NATO and Finnish strength, mainly on the impact of NATO plus Finland's strength with relation to the invasion of Russia, because we've shown that the impacts are way higher magnitude and occur for a longer period of time and increase long-term stability. And that's why I urge a strong negation vote.
Okay. I have a 5-minute speech coming up. Brief roadmap. I'm gonna go through like what happened in the round, going through some points of clash, and then have time to get to the voting issues. So time will begin. 5-minute speech will begin on my first word. Look, Josh, this debate is actually very simple. I'll explain it thoroughly for you, right? We have app impacts, neg impacts, and voting issues, right? First, going on through neg impacts. Like, one of the neg's biggest arguments relies on reducing Russian aggression being their first contention, right? They talk about how Russia's not stupid enough to invade Finland because they fear NATO. And this argument is based on the fact that Russia fears NATO and Russia won't have anything to do with NATO. And this is blatantly false. Russia despises NATO expansion, but they don't necessarily fear it, right? Russia has been messing with NATO countries for years, like annexing Crimea, being accused of U.S. election fraud, invading Ukraine, cutting oil suppliers, etc. So, like,
did you stop? I'm sorry. Did you bring up like the election fraud stuff in your previous speeches? I don't think that's brought up, so you can't really add into the speech.
It's a point of
not an extension of a point. It's a completely new point.
Yeah, it's not really a logical. It's not really a logical extension.
Okay. Up to the judge. I'll move on then. Time will resume on my first word. Like, Judge, if we establish that Russia is not fearing NATO, here's what's going to happen, right? When Russia sees that its next door neighbor joins NATO, they will only be more and more pissed off because they see that there is U.S. presence peeking right at Russia, which is a direct challenge to Putin's influence. Like, what happens when Russia and U.S. are pissed at each other? Cold War. Linked to all three contentions as they go unresponded, especially remember, Judge, instead of diplomatic relations, that right now there are proxy wars with U.S. supporting Russia, Russia annexing Crimea, Russia cutting supplies.
Point of order. POO. You definitely did not mention the word proxy wars before.
It doesn't matter. All of these examples were given before in our other speeches. Moving on. Like with U.S. supporting Ukraine, Russia annexing Crimea, etc. Just like the Cold War with its proxy wars, right? And remember, Judge, the Cold War was the closest point in history of all-out nuclear war, which is further reinforced with this increased provocation argument. So now going on to some points of clash, we talked about the weighing mechanism. You should still provide international security because international security encompasses net benefits. You can't have net benefits without having international security first. However, if you don't buy that, just using the operating mechanism, we still win because the harms that will be present will still be present 10 years down the line. Points of clash, right? We talk about Finland neutrality and my opponent mentioned that Finland neutrality is forced. Even so, Putin still sees the admission to NATO as a challenge, and this is a removal of years of historic precedents to be friends with one of Putin's biggest enemies, right? Finland will fight Russia, as they will get with or without NATO, right? NATO only provides a false sense of and harm of an attack still stands. One bullet, one stray missile can cause all-out World War III, and that is the harm of Russian aggression. Whether or not there's NATO, NATO ambition, right? And furthermore, going down the line, they talk about Russian aggression is not the fault of the Western countries. However, it is the Western fault because the U.S. could have asked for more in the merchant of death trade, right?
Point of order. You definitely do not mention the fact that the Ukraine war and other wars were the Western fault before.
It's a response because in your rebuttal, you said that Russian aggression was not the Western fault.
We said that in the first speech, I think, as a response.
Okay, moving down the line, we submitted to Russia's demands for an unfair trade. Is that not a sign of weakness by the U.S. and West as a whole? And to look at Ukraine, right? Ukraine has been trying to get into NATO for years, and that's why there's the point of Russian aggression. And furthermore, going down the line, we see that the Russian aggression argument. Right? Again, Putin dictates what he wants to do. He can move to the border to increase tensions. He's already testing weapons and working with Middle Eastern nations, what the U.S. knows through the Pentagon paper leaks. Russia is already messing with NATO's most powerful country, the U.S. They don't fear NATO, and expanding NATO just directly challenges him and poises him to do more harmful actions, like continuing the shutdown of the oil pipeline in 102 to convince Saudi Arabia to continue oil production, which means high prices for the rest of the world. They talk about how Putin is unlikely to attack. However, there's still a possibility. If there's possibility, the magnitude will be high. Hence, we still win. And like they talk about the Middle East, we know the relations between the Russia and Middle East because of the Pentagon paper leaks. All they say is that Russia just simply does not have good relations with the Middle East because they realize stuff. However, they know they do because of the Pentagon papers. Russia has already put oil sanctions since the start of the Ukraine war, and like the Cold War, like when the U.S. puts nukes in Turkey, the Soviets dropped nukes in Cuba. Here, NATO poises Finland against Russia. What the harms of what Russia can do next is clear, which is yet another.
Wait, point of order. When did you bring up like dropping nukes in Cuba? That's what I got? That was never mentioned before.
It's an extension of the Cold War argument. We got we see this big harm of human extinction. We see that as Russia gets more and more aggressive, as Russia-U.S. tensions increase, so does the possibility of nuclear war. And this probability is high, the magnitude is high, and the magnitude ultimately outweighs whatever my opponents have to say. Because when you're hitting a NATO country right next to in Russia's backyard, right next to Russia, you see Russia aggression increasing, and you see all this possibility of nuclear war increasing. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you, opponents. This was a very fun debate.
Yep, I agree.
Judge, will you be disclosing orally or will you be writing up an RFD?
I'll need to go through my notes and make my decision.